Hi everyone, Isaiah McPeak here, tech entrepreneur by day, debate coach by night. I'd like to talk today about national class debaters. These are the debaters who regularly end up in the top 10 spots at high school national debate tournaments. Not that everyone in those top 10 spots is national class, and not that every person has a great run in, a random double octafinals round or round 6 when the judge decides to insert their own opinion. Those things happen. But over the course of 10 years of debate coaching, I have coached probably 50 people who have made it to the top 10 national spots, and I've been there myself several times. And there are a few things over the years that I've noticed national class debaters tend to have in common. This talk isn't about what I wish national class debaters did, like always mentor someone else in their debate club or afterwards, or always make sure that their research gets to the bottom of the question for the year and that they're solving a big challenge with a big case. Those are all things that Isaiah wishes were national class debater characteristics, but what I'm going to teach you to debate today are the things that I've observed are national class debater characteristics 9 times out of 10. There are 4 basic characteristics that I've noticed. The first one is that national class debaters understand the basics. My cheesy, awful handwriting here can be inflicted upon you for all time. This says, understand the basics. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean things like the definition of debate, that there are 2 sides on a given topic who are debating in front of an audience. That doesn't sound very compelling or interesting, but great debaters understand that that means certain things about their interaction with the judge, who's the person they're trying to persuade, and not the other team, who is honestly almost irrelevant. But beyond that, there are several deeper questions that understanding the basics helps you answer and have already decided in key moments. For example, is the debate forum that you see yourself being part of as a debater something that's more like Congress passing a bill? Or is it something that's more like 2 advisors advising the president? Or is it something more like 2 professors having a debate in front of Harvard? All of these have subtle nuances in terms of what the judge needs to think in order to vote for one side or the other, and in terms of the roles and attitudes that the speakers have. The best debaters also understand and look for and are listening closely for those variations from the basics. So for example, in quarterfinals at Nationals in 2010, when Josiah McPeak and Patrick Shipsey won the national championship, they had to go up against a team that had won 31 of 32 affirmative rounds over the entire season, and Josiah and Patrick were pretty sure that they were going to have to be negative. So we worked up a strategy beforehand on how to beat this case, and the details are irrelevant. There's a blog we have that explains the whole case study in detail called Case Study, and I think it's called Quarterfinals at Nationals or Josiah or Patrick, but if you search for it, you'll find it. The key that I want to point out is that in front of a panel of community judges, Josiah and Patrick had to explain what is policy debate in the first place and demonstrate that their opponents were stopping short of proposing a full policy. In short, Josiah and Patrick actually ran prima facie arguments, the most basic of basic ideas, in highest level outrounds at nationals, and were able to succeed in front of community judges. That takes an in-depth understanding of the basics of debate. So things you should be looking to master: understand the argument map, understand the bubbles, how arguments relate to each other. I'll give you another example of that in a moment. Understand your role and what you think your opponent's role is in a round, and what are the bars that you have to hop over, what are the hurdles necessary to succeed. Great debaters understand the basics so well that they define a low enough bar to hop over to win and push high bars on their opponents such that the same arguments in 2 different debaters' hands become far stronger in the hands of a national class debater. The second thing that I've noticed national class debaters tend to do is national class debaters see big picture. When it's a team, for example in team policy, usually this is one partner's strength more than the other partner, but in any case, seeing big picture tends to be a strength of the national class debater because they ignite pictures in their audience's mind. Some examples of how this might occur. In cross-examination, the other day I was debating some LD students on the national security versus privacy resolution, and in cross-examination I walked my opponent through a scenario of a transportation security administration person before and after the ideas that it seemed my opponent were advocating. And what I was able to illustrate to the judge was that my opponent seems to expect that TSA agents have a lawyer's understanding of the Fourth Amendment rather than being primarily, first and foremost, a security professional. We pointed out some pretty absurd situations that might happen in an airport and how a TSA agent might respond or not respond and put people's lives at risk. That created an image of my opponent's ideas that they had been simply theoretically talking about warrants, arrests, Fourth Amendment, probable cause, and the big ideas of privacy and national security. The national class debater looks at the actual picture. What is going on? What does this look like? In addition, they see the big picture of all the arguments. And this is the bubbles that I was talking about earlier. So here's something that a national class debater does. They say, all right, what's the test of the round? What's the weighing mechanism? Maybe we agree on it, maybe we don't. Connected to that, what are the points in the round? Maybe there are a couple of harms and a couple of advantages, something like that. Let's call these harm 1, advantage 2. This is the weighing mechanism or test of the round, a goal, a value, etc. They recognize that if their opponent comes up and presents a case that has a different weighing mechanism, then the debate may not be on whether their plan achieves the advantages, but may actually be about whether the advantages matter in terms of the new weighing mechanism. And their opponent likely has some disadvantages associated with that weighing mechanism, which leaves several options for debate. And a big picture debater says, wait a second, if I could exclude their costs disadvantage and exclude their workability disadvantage on the basis of my security weighing mechanism, then merely by arguing that security is more important than whatever their test is, rather than saying these disadvantages don't happen, I can say that these disadvantages don't matter as much as these advantages. That's big picture thinking. But you also might be able to say, what if these advantages better support their weighing mechanism than those? Or what if, okay, I agree to this weighing mechanism, but I can show that the opposite is true in both of these cases. The key to big picture debating is not merely seeing all the options, but then choosing. An intermediate debater will go for all. They will argue the weighing mechanism and the links to the disadvantages and compare and contrast the advantages and disadvantages. An advanced national class debater will choose one, and they will at depth give all kinds of reasons and build out fully supported, warranted arguments on the strategy they've chosen, whether it be which weighing mechanism is superior, that whose advantages support which weighing mechanism, or defeating the advantages and disadvantages on their own terms. This is an example of big picture thinking. Now I need to erase it. Hold on. All right, the third trait of national class debaters is they're able to identify the crux. One of the most simple ways you can use in any debate round as a means to identify the crux is to finish the phrase, what this debate is really about is, and insert one concept, like whether or not warrants are an example of prioritizing privacy or national security. That's a good example of bringing the debate round down to one key concept. The reason that this is national class debate thinking is because identifying the crux shows an audience what it is that they're struggling with and names it for them and gets the audience involved accurately. Intermediate debaters may never name the crux, but those making the transition from intermediate to national class debaters, they may name the wrong crux a couple times and learn that, oh, I'm not very good yet at seeing what my audience is thinking. The national class debater is able to give words to the audience's thoughts and say, this is what it all comes down to. The best tool for doing so is the concept of shared assumptions. A great debater is thinking from A to Z, how do I get here? What's the logical chain of persuasion? And perhaps my opponent and I share some assumptions, like relative importance, or why we're here debating in the first place. But at some point, there's a divergence of thought. And it's all on a single question, and that's the crux. And if that thought goes this way, we already kind of have a logic chain established to the end of the argument. So the great debater is able to say, this is where I need to focus my effort, this is what it all comes down to, and explains to the audience. By so doing, the national class debater narrows the focus of the round instead of expanding the focus of the round. Let's look at the opposite of national class debating here. In Lincoln-Douglas value debate, one of the reasons it's often frustrating to judge is because debaters aren't bringing points down to the crux of the round. Instead, they'll say there's a value on one side, a criterion on that side, and 3 contentions on that side, in addition to, let's say, definitions. So we've got 6 issues so far. Then the neg comes up there, and they have a contentions 1, 2, and 3, even though they ought to have contentions really 4, 5, and 6. So they have 1, 2, 3 contentions, they have a counter value, and they have a counter criterion. Now we're up to 11 issues in the debate round. Then in the 1AR, the 1AR says, I have 4 responses to everything, and they bring it down to 4 different issues than were the issues named and numbered in the AC. And so the 1AR is bringing it up to 15 total issues. And then the negative rebuttal comes up, and they say, well, I've got 3 voting issues. Now these voting issues don't have the exact same titles and numbers as their negative contentions 1, 2, and 3, so they actually feel like 3 new issues, and we're up to 18. Then lastly and finally, the 2AR comes up and says, I have 2 final voting issues. And now we're up to around 19 or 20 issues in any given Lincoln-Douglas value debate round. That's pretty common. Now, go through the judge's mindset. Switch sides for a second. You're not at the lectern, you're at the judge's table. What if one side is winning 1 of those points and losing the other 19? What if they're winning 2 of those points and losing the other 18? What if they're winning 3 of those points and winning the other 17? The amount of possible outcomes in the debate round is so huge that many Lincoln-Douglas value debaters are making good arguments, but they're leaving their judges with impossibly confusing scenarios where the judge has to make up their mind about what's most important and kind of sort out all these issues flying by. National class debaters simplify, simplify, simplify. I can't tell you how many times I've coached people who won nationals by going from a 4 harm case early in the season down to a 1 harm case. It's not that the problems they identified with the status quo aren't real, it's that they recognized what's a judge supposed to do if 1 harm is about costs and the other harm is about lives. What if the debater loses the cost argument and wins the lives argument? Should their plan be passed? What if they lose the lives arguments and win the cost argument? Should their plan be passed? That's so confusing to have to deal with completely different universes of points. And the great debaters say, I'm going to exclude the second best points, and I'm only going to focus on what matters most. And at this point, they've become an advisor to the president instead of a news reporter. Instead of blah, 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 everything, they're saying it's this. That's how you identify the crux. And it often starts from the very first case, and then the case has one main contention that fits with one main test, and you're pulling that through every speech. So the 1AR becomes, here's this one test. What was the test? And pick. It's their value, it's your value. But here's how the judge should think. This is the value, the test of the round. And second, who meets the test? How your side meets the test. That's two concepts that the AF has in the AC, in the 1AR, and in the 2AR, so that throughout the round, the AF speaker is always saying there are just two issues to think about, just two issues, and they're trying to simplify. That's how great debaters work towards identifying the crux of debate rounds. Fourthly, what's the last trait of national class debaters? This one's going to be a little surprising. It has nothing to do with the content of the round, but instead with how national class debaters listen. They break past the flowing ceiling. There's only so good you can do in debate without being really good at flowing arguments. That doesn't mean that you have to have a flow pad that looks as good as your mom's who's judging or watching debate rounds, but it means that you have to create flow pads as good as your mom's on the audience's side of the house. They don't ever have to see your flow. They just have to have a perfect one on their sheets. The way that great debaters blitz through the flowing ceiling there are a few things that intermediates don't realize are happening for the advanced debater. The first, real-time argument response. Some people, when they start out debating, think that prep time between speeches is when you create the responses to arguments. National class debaters are making their responses as their opponents are making arguments, so that by the end of the speech that their opponent just gave, they're ready to give the next speech. One of the things that I like to do when my opponent is speaking over here is go ahead and write 1, 2, 3, knowing that I'll fill up my responses, and I'm going to have a variety of types. So some of these will be really simple and easy, like biased, outdated, no logical conclusion, empirically denied. But then some of these are going to be more substantial and have content or quotations behind them. So first of all, we're making points as our opponents are speaking. Second of all, though, we're capturing the key warrants. What's a key warrant? It means that if your opponents bring up Japanese internment camps and give you all kinds of interesting examples and illustrations on them, the listening debater hears the impact that that has on the judge, and they write down something like Japanese internment camps in quotes. Regardless of what the claim or tag was that their opponents provided, they're listening to the substance, the proof, the warrants that their opponents used to prove it that stuck with the judge. If it was a compelling statistic, I just was with a team that had an $808 a year cost to every person, they said, as a result of frivolous litigation. Then I'm going to write that number down. That's a warrant I want to respond to. Now, I can write it on the left-hand side where my opponent is speaking, but sometimes it makes more sense if I know I'm going to start responding in my responses to this. And so I might be listening, hear their point, and then where I could normally write down a bunch of warrants for what they were saying, I might have their warrants over here as I begin to think about how I respond to them. And I might say, greater privacy violation. The draft, because that's a common point that I like to make in response to the Japanese internment camps, is that the other people who lost their privacy in World War II were actually the soldiers who were forcibly drafted and sent not to internment camps but overseas to trenches. And that national security exchange for privacy, I'm going to argue my opponents, they're not willing to say World War II shouldn't have happened. And if they're not willing to say that, then honestly the Japanese internment camps, while wrong, pale in comparison to the greater privacy and national security trade-offs made during World War II, which were justifiable. So I have to write Japanese internment over here because when I make this point, I'm going to refer to the key warrant that my opponent used. I don't necessarily write it here, which is why when my mom looks at my flow, she might think, oh, you don't have everything in your speech, in your opponent's speech flow. Actually, I do. It's over here on the side where I'm responding to it and I have the key warrants. That's one of the things that is hard to learn from people who haven't debated much when they're teaching how to flow. No fault to them, because on their side of the aisle, their side of the table, everything should look great. We want to, as a result of passing the flowing ceiling, create the impression of great flowing because we're giving great speeches. We're not handing in our flow to the judge, we're delivering a speech from this outline that looks, feels, and is perfect. That's passing the flowing ceiling. Then lastly, there's a third part of the flowing ceiling that great debaters are used to pass it. And it's they tie direct lines from point to point. Intermediate debaters in the 1 and C against a case that had 3 harms, they come up and they say, I have 5 significance responses. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're trusting that first the judge knows that the word significance is associated with harms. And then they're asking the judge to do the mental work of saying which of those points applies to which harms. Do all 5 apply to all 3 harms? Probably not. Maybe 2 points from significance apply to 1 harm, 2 points to another harm, and 1 point to the 3rd harm. Or maybe one of those points applies to all of them. I don't know. But I can't tell you how many times I see these speeches where a negative gets up there and they say, I have 5 significance responses or something similar, where their opponent had never had a significance point called such to respond to. National class debaters say, according to their first harm was this, I have 2 responses. Their second harm was this, I have 2 responses. Their third harm I'm not going to respond to because it fits so closely with my responses. I'm going to give an advantage 1. So let's go take a look down there. And then they move down, so they're constantly tying together all the arguments and giving the judge lines to draw across and see the flow of the arguments. So an intermediate debater gives a new speech roughly every time, and it's newly organized, new voting issues, new significance points. A national class debater shows you exactly what happened to the old arguments to create the new arguments. These 3 points now become this one voting issue. These 2 points are going to be merged together. I'm going to respond to this point. Here are my 2 responses that are direct. That feels a lot more like debating, and it feels, from the audience's viewpoint, much easier to follow because we know where to put arguments. I think that this flowing ceiling is lower than you might expect it because I'm including it here, but it's higher than many debaters that I see debating who are in other areas fully capable of being national class debaters. So I think this is an intermediate skill that's underserved. And when you master this and all the others, you'll see what I mean as you start to see judges writing down exactly what you said and you're almost creating their ballots for them. So a national class debater should coach other people, should get to the bottom of a topic each year, should run big idea cases that actually matter. That doesn't always happen though. What I do see as extremely common traits of national class debaters is that they understand the basics so well that the function of arguments just flow out of their mouth in natural language. That they see big picture enough to grip their audience and be able to articulate what their audience is really thinking. That they identify the crux and are able to simplify around down to this is what matters most, and they're right. And fourth, that they're able to pass the flowing ceiling and connect all the dots for a judge in the round and create a ballot that looks almost exactly like the organization of their speeches. I hope you enjoyed my observations. I'd love to hear some of yours as you watch national class debaters over the years.